To tell you a little bit about Joe, and I like that. About a year ago, I heard a tape that Joe did in Louisiana. And I must have listened to that tape 20 times. And I got his address, and I wrote him a thank you note, because that tape opened up a channel that told me that there was more, and I'd been looking for more. And I needed to thank him, because he opened up that doorway to a different understanding of a God that I didn't understand and I didn't have, and I had a glimpse of. And within less than a week, the phone was going, and it was Joe asking me what I wanted. And I told him. And he told me where to get it. And, you're going to really enjoy him. Thank you.
I got to know him fairly well this weekend, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce Joe today as our third speaker. Joe, you come up, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe. I'm an alcoholic. Can you hear me all right? Where's Pat? Oh, he's in Medicine Hat. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me. It's always overwhelming for me to be invited anywhere. From where I come from 13 years ago, I was not being invited places. I was being asked to leave places. And I was taught from the very beginning that we look for the miracles in Alcoholics Anonymous in the small things, and they'll become the big things, and the big things will become the small things. And I thought it was going to be burning bushes and blinding flashes and clouds opening up, and my sponsor reminded me that I had had several of those, and with the right combination of stuff that I used to use, you could have that on most any given day, and by the next morning it wasn't of any use. And I look for the miracles in my life and the presence of God in every way that I possibly can, because I just love that. And I'm the kind of guy that I never thought I would be the kind to say that I just love when I see that I'm not doing it. Because when I looked at what I do when left to my own power, I see a life of waste and harm and misery and resentment and fear. And I just love seeing myself moved by something more powerful than myself. So I look for the miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous and the power of God in things like being invited places more than once. Or to have a friend that's still a friend after a year, or to have new friends. Dale has been just great, and I understand you probably did assign me one of your sicker members that in the hopes that he might get some help over the weekend by the chairman of the conference informed me of that they picked one of their sicker members to be my host, and I usually get that anyway. Funny thing is, we relate, so that doesn't say much about me now, does it? Art was great. Thank you very much, too. They're both real alcoholics, and I need to be around real alcoholics. And I need to tell you that for me, that's not always the case in Alcoholics Anonymous. I know a lot of people that think they're alcoholic, that have all the power they ever need on their own without having to seek anything other than themselves. And they choose not to drink, and they manage their lives, and you need to talk to them too, because they might just be in the delusion of who's really giving them what they got. So you got to talk to everybody. Because I've certainly been in that place, suffering from a form of denial that I don't even know I'm in, further away from my last drink than I've ever been, 7.5 years sober in the middle of an inventory. And I see something come off the end of the pen that I don't understand with my mind. And my spirit goes, do you see what it's saying there? And I see that I'm in a form of denial stronger than the denial I came here with. And we all know about the denial that we come here with because we talk about it a lot. The only disease that tells you you don't have one, to deny the very disease you suffer from. But at 7.5 years and several times before and several times since, I can experience a form of denial that I don't see alcoholics want to talk about. And I don't think I'm the only one that's ever had it. And I don't think I'm the only one that's ever been in it, because I got a lot of friends and they relate. And it's a real subtle form of denial, and it comes out real subtle sometimes. You get up to take a birthday cake, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years sober, and you get up to take your cake and somebody in the back of the room says, how did you do it? And it sounds real, it sounds all right, doesn't it? My ego goes, how did I do it? Well, my name's Joe, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm powerless over alcohol, and my life is unmanageable, and then you spend 10, 15 minutes telling everybody how you keep yourself sober and manage your life. And you're in a form of denial that you don't want to admit that you're in, and you can't even see it because you're asleep once again. I think the only time that I can be asleep is when I'm laying in bed in that state of consciousness that we call sleep. Now, I don't know about you, and I'm no different than any other alkie in this room, and I'm certainly no more better or any more special. I have seen times where I am absolutely asleep on my feet, walking around, dreaming that I'm alive, and I'm not really hurting anybody, and I'm not really angry, and I'm not suffering from a form of denial, and I'm in it, and I can't see it. And here I am writing this inventory, and off the end of my pen comes the truth about a form of denial that I don't want to admit that I'm in. And sometimes it's not real subtle. Sometimes it's just me taking the credit for what I've been given, and all of a sudden this isn't about grace, or mercy. This is about justice. And words like, now that I'm 7.5 years sober, I have the right to... Or now that I'm 7.5 years sober, I deserve. Any alcoholic in this room better watch out when that word deserve starts to creep in your mind. I remember the first time I went to my sponsor and something really good or something really bad had happened. I don't know which, but when you're new it doesn't really matter. And I said, Don, I don't feel like I deserve this. And he goes, whew. He said, thank God. He said, thank God we're not sitting in rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous where people get what they deserve, or they'd be empty rooms. He said, I think we're in the mercy business around here rather than justice. And you know what? I don't want what I deserve. But when I'm in this form of denial, and I'm taking the credit for what I've been given, and now all of a sudden I have rights, and now all of a sudden it's about justice, I'm in the denial of the grace of God. The denial of the grace of God. Taking the credit for this wonderful gift. I heard a guy say one time, alcoholics are the only people that expect a reward for a gift. I understood that. Now, I don't make notes, but I did notice a couple things that are a little strange here in Canada that I just wanted to mention for a minute. The water faucets are backwards from the United States. Rather than saying, hey, you want to go dance? You say, do you want to go dance? Hey. Well, you cross the border at Canada and everything is backwards, right? You start the meeting by banging on the thing and you end the meeting with a serenity prayer. Right? We start with the Serenity Prayer and we end with banging on the thing and saying the Lord's Prayer. Right? It's very strange. We usually pick 3 topics and then somebody will pick one. You pick one and then you end up with 3. That's especially when you get 3 that really don't go together, right? Somebody should say once, we'll have one. Step 1, gratitude, and having too many topics at a meeting. What else did I notice? Pissed, that's a strange thing up here. Pissed is what you are after you drink. Pissed is what we are before we drink. Right? We drink because we're pissed. You drink and then you're pissed. Right? It's a very strange thing. Very strange. Very strange. Did you notice the Al-Anon vote? When she voted about the song? It was a total Al-Anon vote. She said, everyone in the room in favor of them singing the Lord's Prayer, raise your hand. And that was it. Anyone opposed? No, that didn't come into it. No. With Al-Anon, it ain't about is anyone opposed, right? We're going to have the song, but we just want to see how many people are going to raise their hands, right? You have to be careful when there's Al-Anons around. Reminds me of a story about this lady Al-Anon golfer. She's out on the course and she drives her ball into the woods. And she goes over to look for it. And this little leprechaun pops out from behind a tree and he says, I can't do the voice, but he says, today's your lucky day. She says, oh really? He says, I'm going to grant you 3 wishes because I'm a leprechaun. She says, great. He said, but there's one little catch. Whatever you wish for, your husband gets 10 times. She says, no problem. Hey, right? No, she said, hey, no problem. He says, what's your first wish? She says, every shot I ever make on any course be great. He says, granted, but your husband's shots will be 10 times better. She says, no problem. He says, what's your second wish? She says, $1 million cash. He says, no problem, but you know your husband's going to get 10 million. She says, no problem. He says, what's your third wish? She said, well, I'd like to have just a little teeny heart attack. I love being in a relationship with an Al-Anon. We both love the same person. And sometimes we both love the same person just a little too much. I guess if I tell one how Al-Anons think, I better tell one how Alkies think. Guy's been sober forever. He's on his deathbed, God forbid. And his wife is right there by his bed. And he says, honey, after all these years, I've realized something. And she says, what's that? And he says, well, you were right there that time I got shot. And you stood by me. And you were right there that time I lost all our money in business. You were right there. And you stood by me. And you were right there that time I had a stroke. You were right there. You were always right there. And you always stood by me. And after all these years, I've realized one thing. She says, what's that? He says, you're a friggin' jinx. It's always them, right? What I'm interested in this point in my sobriety is power. To help others and be there for my life. Because for 30 years before I came to this program, I didn't have much power except from booze, and it quit working. And I wasn't there much for my life. And I think it's probably only of those of us that suffer from these diseases that can understand being somewhere and not really being there. We don't necessarily have to be somewhere to not be there. And we don't necessarily have to not be somewhere to not be there. I can sit right here and be in Santa Monica right now. Time travel, out-of-body experience is nothing new for an alcoholic like me. Because I know about not being where, and I always thought my problem was I just can't quite get there. And it always felt like I was trying to get there. And I've recently found out my problem is I have trouble being here. And I can't quite be right here. And my job is to be right here. But the strange thing about that is it's the only place my ego doesn't want me. And it's the only place my ego doesn't want me because it's the only place that God is. God does not exist now in yesterday. And God does not exist now in tomorrow. But see, if I really know that I need God now, I might be a little more concerned about being there with Him now, because now is when that thing's going to happen. That thing that I didn't know about until I came to AA, but it had happened a lot. And just because it happened a lot doesn't mean I knew about it because I came to AA. I came to AA because I didn't know about it. That thing that happens 28 days out of the Michigan State Penitentiary. That thing that happens every time I ever left treatment. That thing that the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous says will happen. And the scary thing about that thing that's going to happen, I don't know what that day might look like or how I might be feeling for that thing to happen. The biggest trick my ego tries to play on me is that it thinks it knows what the day I'm going to drink again would look like or feel like. You know, if I was feeling, and you got these little, if this happens, maybe, deal going on in your head. If she was to die, or if he was to die, or if I was feeling really bad. Guy walks up to me at a meeting in West Hollywood, California one time, and he says, we in the 90s have found out that alcoholism is not a physical, mental, and spiritual disease that no human power can relieve. It's a feeling disease based in shame. I wanted to ask him who we are, but I was more interested in his answer. And I belong to a group that meets on a Tuesday night in Santa Monica, California at 7:30 where we're actually, during the meeting, we're allowed to ask each other questions. We have a 20-minute speaker and then people can share or they can ask each other questions. It's a great way to bring people out that are quiet. It's a great way to hear from one of your friends on whatever the speaker talked about. We're allowed to talk to each other during. We don't become like less close during the meeting because the meeting started. We talk to each other before the meeting, we talk to each other during the meeting, and we talk to each other after the meeting. And we're used to asking each other questions. And we're used to being challenged. I know that's not a nice word in Alcoholics Anonymous nowadays, and we certainly don't like anything that makes us uncomfortable. But therein lies the root of one of the biggest patterns I need to get free of that I brought with me to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the pattern goes like this. If it feels bad, it's bad. And if it feels good, it's good. You even hear people in AA say, if it's God's will, it feels good. Next time you hear someone say, if it's God's will, it feels good, ask them, did they ever write inventory the way it's outlined in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, or did they ever make amends? Because I'll tell you what, doing stuff that felt good for 30 years damn near killed me. And doing stuff that didn't feel good for the last 13 sets me free to where, I don't care about how I feel so much anymore all the time. And isn't that a weird paradox that when I was consumed with how I feel most of the time, I didn't feel good most of the time. But now that I'm not so consumed with how I feel most of the time, I feel pretty good most of the time. So here I am with this guy from West Hollywood, and he's trying to use the big book on me. He obviously didn't know who he was talking to at the moment, but he said, "You know, more has been revealed." That's all right. He said, "More has been revealed." The people that wrote the book realized they only knew a little. And we in the 90s have realized that alcoholism is not a physical, mental, and spiritual disease that no human power can relieve. It's a feeling disease based in shame. I said, "Let me ask you a question." I said, "Did you ever drink again when you really didn't want to, when you were full of shame and you were feeling really bad?" And he said, "Yeah." "See? I told you." And the game was over. I already had won. He didn't even know it. The game was over because he got involved. I said, "Well, did you ever drink again when you didn't really want to, when you weren't feeling any shame and you were feeling really great and you were king of the hill and top of the mountain with no shame at all?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Did you ever drink again when you really didn't want to just feel something?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Did you ever drink again when you really didn't want to not feel anything?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Then what the hell does alcohol care about how you feel, whether you drink it again or not?" And when I was asked that, I didn't know what to say, because see, how I feel and how I'm doing has nothing to do with this thing that's going to happen unless the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous isn't telling the truth. Now, if the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous isn't telling the truth, then my 13 years have been a waste, because I, 12 and a half years ago, decided to base my life on that process in that book by those people that knew how to do that process was going to work. And I rolled the dice and I bet my life on that deal, hoping that they were telling the truth in that book that you all said they were telling the truth in. Because I was tired of trusting one more person with one more way, with one more program, with their inventory and their first step and how I was going to do it. Because every time I get involved in one of those plans, it becomes what Joe Hawk is going to do to keep himself sober. And you know what? If there's anything any alcoholic in this room can do, including me especially, that will keep them sober, they're not powerless over alcohol. You see, I'm doing what I'm doing to seek that which keeps me sober, not so that I can keep myself sober. And you know, I get that lineage screwed up sometimes of like who gets the credit, because I go into this denial that I'm the one doing it, and I slip into that denial of the grace of God. Another story. I was at one of these things once in Flagstaff, Arizona, outdoors. And the whole weekend I heard a phrase that several people used, and they would say, "We're all in the right place doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing." Sounds normal to me. It's funny how one little shift in perception, though, will change my whole idea about something if my mind can be open. I met my sponsor. I told him a little bit about my history. I told him that I'd been to 10 treatment centers and that I had become a therapist in one, drinking with the director of the program that I worked for, and that I had a master's degree in psychology. And he shakes his head and he goes, "My God, you know enough about alcoholism and how you feel and yourself to be dangerous to yourself and everybody around you." He said, "Why don't you say a prayer that what you think you know be put aside just long enough to have an open mind and a new experience?" And I've been using that prayer ever since whenever I start the steps. Because I need to tell you, I'm not from the school that says you work the first 9 steps once. As a matter of fact, if you're new here in this room, I'll give you a challenge. Next time you hear somebody who says you do 1 through 9 once and then live the rest of your sobriety in 10, 11, and 12, just ask them to show you where that is in AA literature. You'll find out something real. Unless you've read something that I haven't read, which might be true. But the sponsors that I have they do 1 through 9 on a regular basis, live a period of time in 10, 11, and 12 until the ego does what it does. And if you want to read about a guy, another doctor, like Silkworth knew about that craving, and Carl Jung knew about the mind, Harry Tiebolt knew about what happens to an alcoholic after having a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. After working the steps, after having a spiritual experience, my ego rebuilds itself. And all of a sudden, meditation isn't that important. All of a sudden, I'm on a dry drunk. All of a sudden, working with others is like, I'll get to it when I can. Because my life, I've now taken back, I gave my life to God, but now I've taken my life. And I talk a lot about my life. And I talk a lot about my time. And time and space starts to close. I'm at that place right now. I've been 10 months since my last set of amends. And I have to say to you that at 11 and a half years of sobriety, I had 30 amends. And they were mostly about the previous year where I was doing a lot with 10 and 11. And those times that I fall asleep, I catch the next time back through. 1, 2, and 3 opens me up to stuff that I couldn't even see. And step 4, I'm not writing about stuff that I wrote about 10, 12 years ago. I'm writing about what 1, 2, and 3 opened me to each time. And I'm so glad to say to you, I'm not operating in the world based on the first time through the steps 12 and a half years ago. I'm operating in the world on what I've seen this last time through the steps and where 10 and 11 took me from that place. This idea about me losing focus on what the deal is here. My first time I came to meetings in my first 90 days, and you all said, get a sponsor, read the book, work the steps, and go to meetings. But you know what I thought you said? I thought you said, get a sponsor, read the book, work the steps, and go to meetings, and those are the things that will keep you sober. But I heard you wrong. What I think you said was, those are the things that will get you in touch with that which will keep you sober. But I didn't hear you. And for 90 days I went to meetings, and I saw guys who went to more meetings than me drink. And I saw guys who spent more time with their sponsor than me drink. And I saw guys who read the book. You know those scary guys that can read like how it works off the top of their head, but it's never in their heart? And I saw guys since then who have worked the steps and forgotten a few simple things, like they're not the ones doing it. I've seen them drink again. And I met my sponsor when I was 5.5 months sober, and I said, Don, I thought you said that reading the book... I actually thought, and I heard it today in one of the meetings that we went to this morning, that if you read the book, that's the same as working the steps. My grand sponsor tells a story about that, and he says a guy calls his sponsor and he says, Gary, I read the book and I drank. Gary says, oh yeah? He says, yeah, I read the book and I drank. He says, you read the book and you drank? He said, yeah, I got it all memorized. And the sponsor gets tired of hearing that, and he says, go in the kitchen and get a cookbook. And the guy goes in the kitchen and he gets a cookbook, and he comes back on the phone. The sponsor says, now read how to make a chocolate cake. He says, okay. He says, now read how to make a chocolate cake. He said, okay. He said, now read how to make a chocolate cake. He says, okay, I got it memorized. He said, now cut me a piece. This might sound like a heretic, but I also believe big book studies are a waste of time. Unless they get you excited about doing what's in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is not a book that's meant to be studied. Not from what I've been told. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is a set of questions and precise directions where, if answered and followed, will create a spiritual awakening. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is like a set of swing set instructions. Put part A to part B, add part C, put in part D, screw in part E. You got a spiritual experience. You got a swing set. So here I am in my first 90 days, and then a few months later I meet my sponsor, and I said, I thought you said that going to meetings and reading the book and getting a sponsor and working the steps were the things that would keep me sober. And I've seen people do all those things and drink. He said, dummy, we did not say that those were the things that would keep you sober. We just hoped all of them together would get you in touch with a power greater than yourself that would keep you sober. Quit worshiping the fingers and look to what they're pointing to. You know, like in church, they say, don't worship the church, or the painting in the Sistine Chapel of the finger that points to God, and they say, don't worship the finger, look to what it's pointing toward. And I think that a good meeting, or a good sponsor, or the big book, or working the steps, all take you to one place. Your own personal relationship with a power greater than yourself. And I missed that for a period of time. And I missed that again from time to time. You notice I'm not spending a lot of time with my drunkalog. That's because a member of Alcoholics Anonymous screwed up my drunkalog. I'll tell you how that happened. Some of you understand drinking with a head full of AA and that we can mess up your drinking. But I wonder if there's anybody in the room that can understand somebody sitting down and doing something and taking you through something that messes up your drunkalog. I'll tell you how that happened. I was at a meeting at 1311 York Street in Denver, Colorado, where I got sober August 17th, 1982. And for that day, I hope and pray that I'm forever grateful. And I came down from one of these meetings, and there's this big, scary guy over by the coffee. Great big guy. He's an ex-sheep herder and a lawyer, which is a dangerous combination. And they call him Big Frank. He says, come over here. He said, you want to have a cup of coffee? I said, yeah. We sit down and we chit-chat for a couple minutes, but I found out chit-chat doesn't last long at that club in Denver. They're going to get down to it one of these minutes. He asked me an interesting question. And he asked me a question that I don't hear asked that much anymore, and I'm as guilty as anybody else of not asking it that much anymore unless you ask me for help. And you know what he asked me? Why do you think you're alcoholic? I said, what? What a strange question to ask in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. Why do you think you're alcoholic? You know what I said? I'm in the room. I must be in the right place. You know that philosophy? He said, son, that's not my philosophy. He said, that's the philosophy of people that don't want to spend time with people like you who still have that look in their eye like, what's wrong with me? And they want to just write it off that everybody in the room is in the right place. I'll tell you a story how I know that everybody in the room isn't in the right place. Our group has helped a lot of people find out where they belong, rather than convince them they all belong. See, we got tired one day of complaining about so-and-so sending such and such to our program. And we got tired of complaining like our problems were of their making. And we started to see that our problems in our group are of our own making. And that all these problems that we bitch about and blame other people for AA's problems can be solved by one thing. One thing. And we started doing it. One-on-one sponsorship. Taking people through the process in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'll tell you one of those many stories of people that have come to our group and they're not in the right room because they're in the right place. See, God don't make no mistakes, but we do. A lot. And I got here, I didn't know what I was. Am I an addict? Am I an alcoholic? Am I both? Is there a difference? Thank God for a man who knew the difference between alcoholism and drug addiction, because they're not the same. I did a lot of drugs, but I'm not an addict. Using the criteria in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, given a sufficient reason, I walked away from drugs. I had power over drugs, couldn't quit drinking for 18 years. Now some guys find out they're both. Some guys come to me, think they're one thing, find out they're another. Kid comes to my house, he says, I want to do this work. He says, I'm 7.5 years sober. I said, what are you? He says, I'm an alcoholic addict. I said, great, let's do the work. We start in that book. He comes back a couple weeks later. He says, I need to tell you something. He says, I've been reading that doctor's opinion, and I need to tell you, that does not happen to me. I don't get a craving for alcohol. I drink alcohol, and I end up back on what I really like. I said, please don't tell me your drug of choice. Boy, there's a word that's filtered into our program by those people that say they're our friends. Next time you hear somebody say that cocaine or alcohol was their drug of choice, here's what we ask them in our group. We'll raise our hand and say, I have a question. I'd like to ask you, is it possible that the drug you think was your drug of choice is the drug that you had no choice over? My favorite drug was alcohol. My drug of choice was yours. It just so happens my favorite one I had no choice over. That's why I'm powerless. If I had a choice over alcohol, why would I be here today? I'm here today because I have no choice over alcohol, and I still don't today, thank God. God loves me more than to give me a choice over something that's going to kill me, because I've given my will to Him, and in the sunlight of the Spirit, there's about as much choice to drink as there is to not drink when you get here. So much for choice. So this kid says, for 7.5 years I've been saying I'm an alcoholic and an addict. I said, how come? And he said the saddest thing I ever heard. He said, because they told me I am. And I thought to myself, no one has ever given you the grace and the dignity to find out your own truth. And that's what we're interested in our group in Santa Monica. Lady comes to our group, a lady that I love very much today. She comes to our group, 9 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, wondering why she doesn't feel really connected like some of us feel. Like some of us feel like this is where I belong. This is where she doesn't have that. 9 years in Alcoholics Anonymous, never sponsored anyone. I think that was by the grace of God, but that's just my opinion. 9 years in Alcoholics Anonymous, she's doing everything in AA but AA. And that's not hard to do nowadays. You know, you can be in AA, not doing AA, thinking you're doing AA in AA, but you're not doing AA. You're doing everything but AA in AA. Only alkies would understand whatever that was I just said. I have absolutely no idea. And she finds a woman that has what she wants, and they sit down in her house once a week, and they start going through that process. And she comes back to this woman's house one day, and she says, I need to tell you something. That doesn't happen to me with alcohol. I'm not an alcoholic. But let me tell you about what it feels like to be around alcoholics. And from Daddy to every boyfriend she ever had, she talks about what it's like to be around one of us, and it's like one of us talking about drinking. Her eyes light up, her blood starts to flow, the energy in the room shifts, and it's a strange disease, these people that love to be around alcoholics. But you know, she needs the work just as much as I do. She needs power just as much as I do. And she had a reason for doing the rest of the steps in the program where she belongs. She belongs in Al-Anon. She found her own truth. And you know, she talks about finding out she's not. Sounds like me talking about finding out I am. Because they're both the same experience. They're two people finding truth. So I sit with this man and he asked me, why did I think I was alcoholic? I said, well, alcohol put me in the Michigan State Penitentiary when I was 19 years old. He said, wait just a second. Why'd they put you in the penitentiary? I said, for writing bad checks. He said, then writing bad checks put you in the Michigan State Penitentiary. And he said, you know what? There's people that go to the penitentiary behind alcohol that can drink tremendous amounts of booze that are about as much alcoholic as the man in the moon. See, because I had this idea that anybody with a drinking problem is alcoholic. And I didn't know that he was describing from our book a guy called a hard drinker who can have the habit badly enough to even be impaired physically and mentally. Booze might even kill him before his time. But given a sufficiently strong reason, he can walk away from alcohol on his own power. And that man screwed up my drunk-a-log because you know what I saw? I'm not alcoholic because of where my drinking took me. He said, let's take all the drama of your drunk-a-log and skim it off the top and just look at you and a bottle of booze and answer 2 questions. Can you control the amount if you take 2 drinks on that bottle and then set it down? And can you control the amount if you pop the top back in that bottle and make up your mind never to drink it again? Can you keep yourself stopped? And that's all it had to do with what happens when I start and what happens when I stop. And I didn't know that the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous spends the first 53 pages from the doctor's opinion to the bottom of More About Alcoholism just to get across those 2 ideas. And then, if they haven't gotten it through my thick alcoholic skull, on the next page they then repeat themselves, knowing who they were writing this to. And they say, if when you honestly... We hope we've made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. Because if when you honestly want to, you can't stay quit, or when drinking, you have little control over the amount, you're probably alcoholic. And in these real strategic places throughout this book, they leave you little outs. Rarely. Probably. Maybe. Sort of. And the people that I know, going back to my great-grand sponsor who's still alive, Paul Martin in Chicago with 50 years of sobriety, who's been doing this work in a group where they do this work on a regular basis, over and over and over. He says that he believed when he was 12-stepped by Dr. Bob that they put those words in this book through this process if you're looking for a way out. They call them drunk traps. And if you're looking for a way out, they give you several places where you'll see, it says rarely. It says probably. And then the question comes, am I really alcoholic? Why am I really here? Am I here because I can control alcohol? Or am I here because I can't control alcohol? And if I can't control alcohol, where and how am I going to find some power? And then they say, if lack of power is your dilemma, and where and how seems to be the next obvious question, like where am I going to find some power? And it has nothing to do with virtue. It has to do with like your own desperation. Then they say, well, that's exactly what the rest of this book is about. The main object of this book, once you get past step 1, is to enable you to find power, which will solve your problem. So the symptoms for me were simple. All I had to do was look back through my drinking. You either got the craving for booze or you don't. If you don't get the craving for alcohol, why would you need to go any further? Just drink the way you want to drink. Go on with your life. And if you don't get this obsession, why in the world would you need any power? You just make up your mind not to drink. Choose. And what we don't know is that we're surrounded by those people all around us in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, it's not our place to judge unless I'm asking you for help. You better believe if I'm asking you for help, I'm going to know you're alky like me and that you need power rather than that you have power. Because there's really only 2 schools in AA. There's alkies with power and there's alkies that need power. But you got to talk to the alkies that think they have power, because they might be in delusion of what's really given it to them. They might be in that denial of the grace of God. They might be taking the credit themselves, like I have. They might think the choice is theirs and that they have power. And they need to know whether they belong here or not, like I did after being here for 5.5 months. When the next part of my disease came to the surface. Because you see, those symptoms are simple. But if all you think is we have a 2-part disease, body and mind, then the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous is wrong. Because the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous says we're not only bodily and mentally ill, we're spiritually sick. And they've started to talk to me for the first time after 10 treatment centers, after being in AA for 6 months. They started to talk to me about the root of the disease rather than just the symptoms. But I had to get clear on the symptoms to see if I had the root. And all these places I ever went, all they ever did was chop the tree off at the ground, and what's left there is that part that's going to grow again. They always left that root because, you know, no human power can remove can heal that root. No human power can stop that root from growing again. It takes a power. It takes the power of nature, the power that created that root, the power that created us all to heal that root if it's a spiritual malady. And they even gave me a page, and I'll challenge anybody to go home today, and if you want to challenge yourself just a little bit, go home today, read the middle paragraph on page 52 in the chapter to the agnostic. And if that describes you before you ever drank, and that's the stuff you used to pour booze on, and it would go away for a little while, and that's the stuff that's there when alcohol doesn't work anymore, and that's the stuff that's there sitting around Alcoholics Anonymous for 5 or 10 years, thinking that meetings and not drinking are treating your disease, and that stuff is there and it's in bloom, it sounds like this. It feels like this. You're having trouble with personal relationships. Now, there's certainly not anybody in the room having any troubles with personal relationships. You can't control your emotions. Step 10 and 11 say you should be able to if you have some power in your life. You have a feeling of uselessness, and you're full of fear. You can't seem to make a living that's satisfactory to you by itself. You never quite get there. You're full of fear, and you're unhappy. And that page described me before I ever took a drink, sitting in my parents' backyard, 10 years old, dreaming that a spaceship was going to land and a little green man was going to get out and he was going to say, "You weren't born here on this planet. We brought you here as a teeny baby. This has just been a test." And when I read the doctor's opinion and he says that a part of my disease separates me and differentiates me like a distinct entity, boy, did I know how that felt before I ever took a drink. I remember going to Don early on and I said, "Don, I feel terribly inferior and insecure and out of place." And his eyes lit up and he said, "Do you want to know why you feel inferior, insecure, and out of place?" Nowadays, when my sponsor says, "Do you really want to know why?" I think for a minute before I answer him. It's one of those buzzwords you got to learn when you're new. Like, "Do you really want to know why you feel inferior, insecure, and out of place?" I said, "Yeah, I've been looking for the answer to that for 20 years. He said, "Do you really want to know why you feel inferior, insecure, and out of place?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Because you're inferior and insecure and out of place." And that didn't feel good to my poor, sensitive, alcoholic feelings. Because whatever feels bad is bad, and whatever feels good is good, if I'm still in that frame of mind. And anything that makes me uncomfortable, I must get away from. And that's the pattern I brought here with. That's the pattern of my drinking for 18 years of my life. And slowly but surely that pattern had to be broken. Because sometimes getting free doesn't feel good. My ego makes it that way. And sometimes feeling good, it's killing me. It did not feel good to fully concede to my innermost self that I'm alcoholic. Nowadays, I don't know which would be worse to find out. That you really are or that you're really not. So let's stay in some kind of middle ground. Let's kind of be sort of alcoholic, but I don't need to do what those people do. Because I'm coping, and I'm dealing with how I feel, and I'm choosing not to drink because I'm keeping myself sober. Then you're in the middle ground. You're in that terrible middle place where you're not really sure that you are, and you're not really sure that you're not. You can't really concede to the program because you don't really need it, and you can't really get out because you really don't know what you are. That is a place that I don't ever want to be again in AA. It's a terrible place. On the fence. So I was moved from that place by a simple admission that I'm bodily, mentally, and spiritually powerless. And that my unmanageability is inside, not out here. And by admitting that, I was literally moved into another door. It's like a series of doors. One closes behind you, but one always opens when the one behind you is just closed. And you're in that second step place where a guy like me gets to choose about God, everything or nothing. A drunk like me gets to choose God. And all I had to do to make that choice was just be willing to believe that maybe there's some power greater than myself, because I need power. If you get to the my friend always says, you can't go to the second step in a good mood. You'll never get through the second step based on virtue. No alky's got enough virtue to get from 2 through 12. It's got to be that desperation that moves you. So it's booze and God. I mean, I wasn't just walking down the street one day, a healthy, well-adjusted guy, and I thought, gee, I'm going to go in there and fit in with the losers of the world who are like alcoholic and powerless and their lives are unmanageable. I really want to go in and fit in with those people? No. I love these people that think God was the only thing that brought them to AA. I think alcohol and God, both powers together, create something real interesting. Especially when one is done. Especially when you're done with the one that you've had faith in. And you need the one that you don't have a contact with. When that strange place is there where there's two parts of you and one of them's getting stronger and the other one's getting weaker, and some days this one's stronger, and that means there's been a split in your ego. And there's room for something more powerful. You start to think different. For the first time in 18, 20, 25 years, you have days where you don't want to drink. And all you've had were days and weeks and months where you way beyond had to. I mean, way beyond wanted to. Way beyond choice. I walked out of the Michigan State Penitentiary when I was 21 years old. And I made my first report on the 28th day. Well, I made my first report on the first day. I made my second report on the 28th day. And on the 28th day, he told me how well I was doing. And I told him how well I was feeling. And he told me the conditions of my parole. And I told him I'd follow them. And I meant it. And the conditions of my parole were to not drink or take drugs or leave the county or hang out with ex-felons or go into bars. That's like telling me I can no longer breathe. And I tell him that I'm going to be able to do that, and I walk out of his office with a strange idea that I need a pack of cigarettes, into a bar, pick up a drink, call an ex-felon, drive out of the county, and get some drugs, and wake up in a dope house 5 days later out of a blackout, 125 miles away. And I didn't choose to do that. It had nothing to do with choice, what's needed, what's right, what's necessary. Don't even play into me and alcohol. Another day, a few years earlier, before I was sent to the penitentiary, was the day of my father's funeral, and I had been brought from a little white room in the same hospital that he died in the intensive care unit. And I got to watch him die in that hospital that I was locked up in the psych ward, because they didn't have a treatment center. And I got to watch him die, and then 2 days later, they took me from that little white room with a guard to my father's funeral, and we stopped at my mother's house, and she said something to me she never said to me in the 6 years that I'd been drinking. She said, "Please don't show up at your father's funeral drunk." And with all the love in my heart and everything that I could muster, I chose not to drink. I didn't want to drink. I didn't need to drink. It wasn't necessary, and it definitely wasn't right. And I asked, could I go across the street to say hello to a friend with no ulterior motive? And I walked across the street to say hello to a friend. He said, "Why don't you have a beer before your father's funeral?" I said, "I think I'll have 2 just to take the edge off." And somewhere between the second beer and the 20th beer, I lost the kind of power it takes to choose how much I was going to drink. And I showed up to my father's funeral so drunk, the guard that brought me tied me to a tree by my ankle with a chain at my own father's funeral. And I didn't want to do that. And I didn't choose to do that. And it wasn't needed, it wasn't necessary, and it definitely wasn't right, because those things assumed that I had some power. I didn't have any power those days and many other days. When they told me that I could find God the same way I came to believe in booze, I was absolutely flabbergasted. And I'll say it one more time for those of you that are new. You can come to believe in God the same way you came to believe in alcohol. So how did I come to believe in alcohol? Imagine if someone would have come to you the day before your first drink and said, this is what alcohol is going to do to you, and this is what alcohol is going to do for you. I would have said, man, you're crazy. Alcohol is going to put me in the penitentiary? Alcohol is going to destroy my life? Alcohol is going to take that fear? Alcohol is going to give me the power to walk across that gym to ask that girl to dance? Alcohol is going to do for me what I can't do for myself? Man, you're crazy. The day before I took my first drink. So how did I come to believe in alcohol? I came to believe in alcohol by seeing it work in you. By making a decision and taking some action and getting some results that I could see, feel, use, and direct. You think you're having trouble coming to believe in a power greater than yourself? Look at the one you believed in more than anything else in your life ever. Booze. Nothing came between me and booze. I forsake no one for it. Anyone who came between me and booze was eliminated. I believed more in booze than I did the love of a mother or a father or anyone I ever loved. I know what it's like to believe in power. Because I used to get power from my God, and my God was booze. And I got that belief in that God by making a decision and taking some action and then having faith. Faith was acquired by action. The guy says, you'll come to believe in God the same way. You'll see that it works in others, and I did, in your eyes and in your life. You'll make a decision at the third step, and then you'll take some action in 4 through 9. And then those promises will come true in your life. And based on those promises, then you'll have faith. And you'll see you came to believe in God the same way you came to believe in booze. And I have. And you know what the bet is today? That my faith and contact and power that I receive from God is stronger than the power and the contact that I have with booze. I hope this one's stronger today, or I would be drunk. That's the bet each and every morning. I don't choose every morning not to drink because I don't have the power to choose not to drink. I bet my life on God every morning, and I establish that contact in the morning by doing what's necessary to establish a contact with Him. And that meant moving on in the steps. That meant just taking that kernel of belief that maybe what happened for you could possibly happen for me. It's so sad when they say there's only 12 promises in our program. And they're on page 83, halfway through the 9th step. Down in the States, they worship those 12 promises. And you know what it tells people that are new? You're not going to get any of AA's promises until you're halfway through the 9th step. But you know what? There's promises from the title page through every single step. There's some wonderful promises before you even take the 3rd step. One of my favorite promises comes after a thorough 5th step. And it says you can return home and you can sit at perfect peace and ease. What more have I ever wanted? Thinking in your mind gets a bad rap in Southern California. They tell you like your mind is a terrible place to go and it's not a great neighborhood to hang out in alone. But they never tell you what it says later on when you get to the 10th and 11th step, that your mind can become a working part of your life and that you can come to rely on it and that your thought life will be placed on a much higher plane when your thinking gets cleared of wrong motives in 4 through 9. And how many people know that the Big Book promises a whole other sense other than the 5 that we're used to? A 6th sense. What are we're used to smell and touch and taste and sight and hearing. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous says you'll get a 6th sense from the first 9 steps, a new sense that you can begin to use and rely on. And you know what that is? That's intuition. That's intuition when amazing things happen when you start to trust this little quiet inward voice. And I began to trust it that day when we got on our knees to do the 3rd step prayer. But before that there was a decision, and before that there was a requirement, and before that there were 3 things I needed to be convinced of. The 3 things I needed to be convinced of are in the ABCs, and the requirement is that I needed to be convinced that my life run on my will is not successful, and I met the requirement for the 3rd step. And no one in the meetings had ever told me that in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a requirement to take the third step, that you be convinced that your life run on self-will cannot work. And I got to the third step and I was convinced. But several months before I started this work, I sat in this meeting in North Denver where they care more about you than how you might feel about what they have to say. See, I care about each and every person here that much. And that's a hard place to get taken to in AA, where you care more about the alcoholic than how he might feel about what in the world you might have to say. Because they cared that much for me. And I remember sitting in that meeting before I was convinced of these three pertinent ideas, before I conceded to my innermost self that, you know what, I'm really alcoholic and I cannot manage my life and no human power can fix me, and I'm willing to believe that not only God can, but He will if I seek Him. Before I was convinced of those three pertinent ideas, before I started on the title page and went through this process with a sponsor that knew how to do that, before I saw on the title page, just from him talking to me about the circle and triangle, that there's three parts to this program. And you're not in AA just because you're a member of the fellowship. You're just a member of the fellowship. And there's also the recovery program, and there's also the service program. And that our program is a three-part program. And I was expecting the results of a three-part program hanging out in 1/3 and not involved in recovery or service. And then I saw there's 36 spiritual principles. And then he told me there's a three-part program for a three-part disease, body, mind, and spirit. And just talking to me about the circle and triangle opened the whole program to me that I had not heard in 6 months in AA. I've seen that circle and triangle shared with somebody with 25 years who it opened the whole program to him after 25 years that he wasn't in. It's not hard for an alcoholic to see he's been somewhere that he hasn't been for a long period of time. Or that he's believed a lie that isn't true for a long period of time. It's no big deal for me anymore. Every inventory I've ever written shows me the lies I currently think are true, and they're not. So I was sitting in this meeting in North Denver where these men care more about you than how you might feel about what they have to say, and I was doing the old AA shuffle. And at that group they used to call me Joe Osmosis, because I thought if I sat between the guys with all the sobriety, if I sat down between them, that it might rub off on me, so they called me Joe Osmosis. And I was sitting in that meeting and I was doing the AA shuffle, and it went like this. I don't know if anyone else in the room has ever done the AA shuffle, but it goes like this. I turned it over and I took it back. And I turned it over and I took it back. And this old guy says to me, "Why don't you shut up and sit down?" And you know what? I drank enough alcohol to shut up and sit down. You know in the book what they call the Great Persuader? That beats you finally into a state of reasonableness? More power than a mother, more powerful than a lover, more powerful than a brother, more powerful than a therapist, more powerful than a sponsor, more powerful than a group. Alcohol, they call the Great Persuader. It had beat me into a state of reasonableness. And I sat down and I shut up. And he said, if you're still turning it over and taking it back, you haven't turned it over because you don't know the difference between a decision and a commitment. And I learned to ask the second greatest question I ever learned to ask in Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, what do you mean? And if you really want to shake things up when these old-timers throw these cliches out like you're supposed to understand what they mean, start to ask, what do you mean when you said, and you'll find out something real interesting in AA. Now, I'm not going to tell you what you're going to find out, but you're going to find out something real interesting. And I said, what do you mean? He said, there's a difference between the third step decision and the commitment that follows. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's like telling someone to go sit in the corner and pray for ham and eggs, and then they just sit there. They'll probably starve to death because all they did was make a decision. But if you tell someone to go sit in the corner and pray for ham and eggs, and they decide to do that, and they go sit in the corner and they pray for ham and eggs, and then you show them how to get up and put one foot in front of each other, and they make one hell of a commitment, they'll probably eat ham and eggs. And I said, what do you mean? He said, there's a difference between a decision and a commitment. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's like a chicken and a pig walking down the road. And they come to a big sign on this church that says, help feed the poor. And the chicken looks at the pig and he says, we ought to do something about that hunger problem. And the pig says, what could you and I do about a hunger problem? And the chicken says, we could feed those poor people ham and eggs. And the pig has a little more sense than I did when I took the third step, because he says to the chicken, for you that's just a simple decision to lay some eggs, but for me that's one hell of a commitment. And I didn't get it. I didn't get it. But several months later, when I started this process and I got to that page where the ABCs are, and I had done everything in between, I remember one night at that same meeting, they're having a meeting on the promises on page 83, and I started to whine. I said, those promises aren't happening for me. And this man said, you know how to get the promises on page 83? I said, no. He said, do everything from page 1 to 82. It's that simple. And you know, when I did everything from the title page up to the ABCs, I was convinced of 3 pertinent ideas. And when I did everything from the title page up to the requirement for the third step, I was convinced of the third step requirement, that my life run on my will doesn't work. Then I got to the third step decision, and I got to decide about what I'd like God to be as far as my director, my principal, and my father. And I got to decide what I'd like to be, like His actor, His agent, and His child. My sponsor says there's one idea in the third step decision. If it could go from your head to your heart, you'll never have a problem with low self-esteem ever again, because there would be nothing you could ever do or accomplish or be given or gain or earn or get or you could ever have that would surpass the realization in your heart that we're all children of God. So much for the low self-esteem problem. I'm a child of God. I get to be an agent for God. I get to serve God. I've gotten to sit in my living room with over 200 people in the last 10 years and watch them go from steps 1 to 9 and then teach them about using 10 and 11 in their life. And you know, of those, this is not bragging about my great works. This is about the process in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous of those 200 people that made it to step 9. Not the ones that pooped out in step 4 or 1. But of those that made it to step 9, 2 out of 200 drank. 1 refused to finish amends. And you can finish amends, even the ones you can't find. The Big Book is real specific. And I know 400 or 500 people around this country that every time they go through the steps, they finish every amends that they're consciously aware of. I get to go to a conference with 400 of them this summer in July in Breckenridge, Colorado, that share in this process from 30 different states. I have a spiritual advisor with 36 years. She just had her birthday. She runs the central office in Denver. She's been through the steps 35 times, and every time through the steps she's finished every amends that she's consciously aware of. And I think the most overlooked word in all the steps is the last word in step 8. And you'll have to look at that yourself and see if it isn't. Because I can become willing to make amends to them all and be given the power to do that. I heard a man at a meeting one time who was selling God short, and he said, the idea that you can make all your amends is like thinking you could take a feather pillow and throw the feathers off the top of the Empire State Building and go find every one of those feathers. And my friend Mark from Texas says to that man, what if you're in touch with the creator of the feathers? Could he take you to every one that's been lost? If I'm relying on myself, I can't make any of those amends. So I got up off my knees after doing that prayer, and I learned to ask the best question I ever learned to ask in Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, Don, if that was just a decision, then how do you turn it over? A lot of people think taking the third step is turning their will and their life over to the care of God. It's not. It's just deciding to. And I said, if that was just a decision, how do I turn it over? He said, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 acts against your will, contrary to the way you've lived your life. And I'm here to tell you, to do inventory the way it is in our book and see for every resentment you've ever had where you played a part. Even the resentment toward a father who was 60 years, he was 57 when I was born, and by the time I was 10, he was 67 years old, and I hated him since my earliest memory. I got to see how I was playing God at 10 years old, because I knew better than God how old that man should have been and how he should have been doing it. and how He should have been to me. I knew better than God how it should have gone. And I was playing God way before I ever took a drink. And I started to feel some forgiveness in that first inventory for a man that I hated since my earliest memory. And I went to the meeting. And you know what I said in the meeting? I said, I'm starting to feel some forgiveness for someone I've hated my whole life, since my earliest memory. Does anyone in the room think I'll ever be able to make amends to someone who's been dead for 9 years? And 3/4 of the room said, can't do that. Can't make amends to someone who's dead. But thank God for you people in the other fourth of that room, the people that I'm asked to stick with, the winners, who think that God is everything. They said, sure you can. Do what your sponsor says when you get to step 9, and you'll be able to get free too. Because God is either everything or He's nothing. 3/4 of the room said God is nothing. He's measurable. He can't do that for you. The other fourth of the room, those of you that I choose to stick with, said, sure He can. And then I read this thing to someone I don't trust. It was against my will and contrary to the way I've lived my life. And then I asked something I'm not really sure of yet that's against my will and contrary to the way I've lived my life, to ask something other than me for help to remove this stuff, and then make a list of all those that I've harmed, and then sit across from you and go to His grave and sit and make amends about the things I did that hurt Him, and I get to walk out of that graveyard free because God does work. I'll give you one story, and I'm going to shut up, to testify to the power of this process. A couple of years ago, I was engaged to God's will, and she left me. And that's pretty harsh when it was a direct revelation from God. And for a couple of days, I go around to meetings and I'm whining. I go to meetings, not my home group, but I go where I can whine. And I said, because in my home group where they're allowed to ask questions, I wouldn't get away with whining. And I said, like the guy on his deathbed, I said that she left me. A couple days later, I couldn't stand it any longer, and I went to a friend, and he said, why don't you go home and write inventory about her leaving you? And I went home, and all I had to do was put her name on the left-hand part of a piece of paper, her name, and that she left me, because the book says to put down who and why I'm angry. And that is the truth about who and why I'm angry, isn't it? That's what I think is the truth. She left me. And that's the truth that nobody else can help me see anything other than. Then somehow I say a prayer, and I'm given the grace to see where 6 or 7 different areas of self were hurt, threatened, or interfered with when she left me. Then somehow I'm turned to look at it from an entirely different angle, and I see where my selfishness and how I did it with her, not just a little check mark, how I did my selfishness, how I did my self-seeking, how I did dishonesty, and what my fears were, drove her away, and that she didn't leave me, and what I thought was the truth turned into a lie, and what I thought was a lie that I had anything to do with it turned into the truth. And I got to get free on that one line from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, that my troubles with her leaving me were of my own making. And I got to get free. And she didn't have to come back for me to get free. Then, a couple nights later, after I read this to somebody and did 6 and 7, I sat in my home group and I said, I'm praying for the willingness to make amends. And this little kid in our group, an ex-Crip gang member, he raises his hand. He says, is it possible you're not praying for the willingness to make amends, and you'll know the exact moment you're willing? And I wanted to say to him, you little so-and-so, how dare you talk to me that way? But I said to him, maybe it is true. How will I know the exact moment I'm willing? He said, the exact moment you're willing, you'll hear a really strange noise. And I said, what? He said, yeah, the exact moment you're willing to make that amends, you'll hear a really strange noise. I said, like what? He said, like this. A couple people in the room have made amends, for God's sakes. The exact moment I was willing to make that amends, I heard a really strange noise, me knocking on her door. Then I heard another really strange noise. Out of my mouth came, can I talk to you about the harm I caused you? Then a little while later, I heard another strange noise come out of my mouth. I said, do you need to tell me how any of that hurt you? It's very important I do this to stay sober. 2.5 hours later, I heard another really strange noise come out of my mouth. I said, is there anything I could ever do to make right this wrong? And I listened, and I shut up. And that was a really strange noise when nothing's coming out of my mouth. And I finish those men's, and I get to sit in the consciousness of the presence of God. And I get to be here in this moment. And I get to decide about living my life. And I get to decide about where I want to live, and how I want to live, and who I want to live with. And I now find that I have power over alcohol, and my life is manageable, but on a daily basis I need to remember where that power comes from, and that's what 10 and 11 is all about, just to fit me to be there for you. That one guy who at 5 years is dying of a part of the disease he doesn't even know he has, who needs to hear that maybe there's more, who needs to know, like I needed to hear from Don, that the power of God runs deep. And the more you seek, the more you'll be given. And the more you're given, the more you'll have to give. And you're going to love to be able to give. And the more you love giving, the more you're going to get. And all I had to do was admit that I didn't have any power at all. To receive more power than I'd ever been given. But as long as I thought I had any at all, I never got any more than I already had. Which was little or nothing at all. Thanks for asking me to come.